everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Contact Listens Tools for Tough Moments podcast. I am Azita of Contact Caroline, and today we're going to be interviewing Michelle. Michelle, would you like to
Yes,
introduce yourself?
absolutely. I am the Deputy Executive Director here at Contact Caroline, but my alter ego, I am a licensed marriage and family therapist as well. And so, in my role as a relational therapist, a lot of what we talk about are boundaries when we are trying to support couples and families, or even when I'm working with individuals. Most of the conversations that we come to end up talking about how we can set boundaries with others or boundaries for ourselves. So I'm excited to talk about that today and share a little bit more of my other type of knowledge with our viewers.
Yes, I'm excited. Today we're going to talk about boundaries and how they might serve you and help you show up in your life. Okay, so let's talk about that. Why does it matter? Why do boundaries matter?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that gets thrown around a lot is that, the word boundaries, but not a lot of people really have a concrete understanding of what they are or how to implement them in our lives. And when it comes down to it, boundaries are limits that we set around what we're willing to accept in relationships and situations. They help us define where we end and someone else begins, right? So it's really understanding the
Mhm.
space we're taking up and the space that they're taking up. I think a lot of people worry about setting boundaries and thinking that they'll harm relationships, but really they're just guidelines that help relationships stay healthy and sustainable. So they create those rules. We teach people how to treat us, and that's really
Mhm.
important. And I think without boundaries for ourselves, we will end up resentful and exhausted, or
Mhm.
maybe we pull away and get disconnected. And it's really important to focus on those as tools for our own mental health and well-being.
Yeah, and for protecting those relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I've heard it said boundaries are the space where I can love myself and you at the same time.
Hmm.
Means I can honor my needs and also bring you in and have you part of that
Yeah.
without, like you said, needing to pull back or push
Yeah.
people away. You teach them, like you said, that platinum rule,
Yeah.
treat people how they want to be treated.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people feel guilty when they try to set a boundary, like they're being selfish or unkind. So what would you say to somebody who feels that way?
Yeah. Um, First, I think that's a pretty common experience. I can't think of anyone probably that hasn't felt worried about setting a boundary
Yeah,
before.
for sure.
And when I think about the work and the families and individuals and couples that I've worked with, a lot of us have grown up in environments where putting others first at the
Mm.
expense of our own well-being was praised or expected. So we may be
Mhm.
conditioned to really not have the best boundaries for ourselves. And that's
Right.
understandable. When you've learned something and you've done something one way for a long time, it can be really, really tough. Also, probably most of us have experienced that when you set a boundary, people can have some really big reactions, some of which are pretty uncomfortable. I think a lot of times people might think, oh, I shouldn't have set that boundary because of that big reaction. But it helps to flip that in your own mind and say, that's just proof that I needed to set that boundary, that that big
Mhm.
reaction really lets me know that no, it was smart for me to go ahead and probably do this now before things got worse or later on.
Mhm.
And it really is that act of respecting yourself and the relationship and that other person.
Yeah. So, can you describe we've been talking about the boundaries and why they're
Mhm.
good, but what's a boundary? Before we go further, what are we talking about
Yeah.
with boundaries?
I think people wonder like what is it? How do I know I need a boundary a lot of the time?
Mhm.
And so the big cues you want to look for within yourself, resentment is one of the biggest indicators that we might need a boundary. And it's interesting because Brené Brown, if you've ever heard of her, she's really great. And she will say that resentment is a function of envy. So
Mm.
we
And
often, if you're feeling, if you're feeling resentful, a great example of this is if you're resentful at work. So say you've been picking up extra tasks, you're working extra hours, boss asks you to do something at 4:45 on a Friday and you're like, "Yeah, I got it." And you get upset because Susie has been leaving at 5 and not doing as much extra work as you have. So we might start to feel resentful towards Susie, right? But really, we're envious that Susie's holding boundaries for herself that maybe we're not holding for ourselves. And so it can be really helpful to think about that, as that resentment is something to think about for it.
Mm-hmm.
We also might think about our thoughts. So if you're feeling tense, or maybe before an interaction with someone, you're feeling your heart's beating, you're breathing shallow. Maybe also if you are afterwards, if you're feeling tense, you're feeling drained, you're feeling exhausted. Those
Mm-hmm.
are things to pay attention to.
Yeah. I can relate to that that feeling of resentment, like in the moment when you say, yeah, I'm gonna do that. I would love to do that. I'll take that invitation, or I agree to do you that favor. And then there's this internal sense of, why did I say I
Yeah.
would do that?
Yeah.
And you could have held that boundary and said, thank you, but I am not interested in doing that, or finding a kind way of saying it. But it's that feeling that really gives me that sense I've not held a boundary.
Yeah, I think that's a really great thing to think about. If you're feeling
Hmm.
that way about something, it's a good sign that maybe you need to take a look at how you're interacting with all of that, for sure.
Hmm. Yeah.
I also think too, if you feel like you can't say no, or that saying no would be catastrophic, that might be a sign too that something's off, and
Hmm.
you need to kind of look internally and take a little stock of what's going on.
Yeah. So sometimes we don't realize we needed a boundary till after we've already started to feel resentful or burnt out. So how can we catch it earlier?
Yeah. I think, like we just talked about, knowing afterward that something maybe was off is helpful. But you're right, as we practice boundaries, we might want to check in with ourselves before. So asking yourself on a regular basis, am I doing this because I want to, or because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? That's something to
Hmm.
look at. If you are a person that says yes very quickly, that is so me. You might get yourself into the habit, though, of giving yourself some time before accepting or declining a request. I've got some tools in mind later, maybe that I'll tell people. And then something I talk to my kids about all the time is it's important to remember that no is a complete sentence, no, period. And so we often will feel like we need to justify ourselves, or we need to apologize when we set a boundary. That goes back to that behavior of putting others in self sacrifice.
Hmm.
Sometimes we want to sacrifice, right? But I think when we remember that all we do need to do is say no, and that the boundary is enough, that can really be helpful. So those are those things to remind yourself and catch yourself before you say yes, or before you go down the road, and just give yourself a bit of time, think about it, or just remember I can just say no.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said about sometimes you want to sacrifice, sometimes you're choosing that sacrifice.
Mhm.
And that means boundaries are flexible.
Yeah.
You don't always have this boundary of I'm not going to help people move, or, I can never do whatever. But when you're making the choice to give that extra,
Mhm.
that effort, um, I think they say you can't pour from an empty cup, but you really can't pour beyond a certain point, because some of that last part you need that part for yourself. And so
Right.
your cup is going to be different on different days or for different things. So
Yes.
I love that choice of choosing to make the sacrifice, and how that is not going to make you resentful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things I think people get wrong about boundaries is they think that they're supposed to be super rigid,
Right.
and they really shouldn't be. So it shouldn't be super rigid, like you're hitting a brick wall and you just absolutely
Hmm.
can't give grace or maybe go above and beyond at certain times. They also shouldn't be like super permeable, or where it's like every,
Right.
you're giving yourself. So like I always like to think of it like kind of like those force flex trash bags, where it's got some give but it's still going to hold. And that's really a good way to think about boundaries, is that you can push them a little bit sometimes, especially for the people you care about, but you don't want to break yourself, right?
Right. Wow. I love that metaphor. That's helpful. Okay. So in the newsletter this month, you shared a very practical tool. The if you do X, I'll do Y. So can you walk us through that and why it's effective?
Yes. So most of us might make a mistake of, when we set a boundary, we're going to tell that person what they're not going to do.
Mm,
And what that actually is incorrect when we set boundaries is we don't have control over what other people do. We really
Right.
don't have control over people's behavior. I have worked with families a lot of times where maybe a sassy teenager will say something fresh to their parents in the
Mm-hmm.
therapy room, and the parent will say, "You can't talk to me like that." And in my mind, I don't say this, of course, I'm like, "Well, they just did." Right?
Right.
Like, we
Right.
don't have control over other people's behaviors. So, the formula of if you do X, I'm going to do Y, that is a formula that helps people to understand if you behave in a certain way, which I have no control over, I will behave in a certain way.
Mm,
And that I absolutely have control over. So
right.
that's where we are harnessing our control. And we also aren't creating this ultimatum or creating a power struggle that
Mhm.
really it doesn't exist. I can control my own behavior. I can't control your behavior. So if you do
Mm.
X, I'll do Y.
I love that. You hear that all the time. Like, that's a boundary for me. I heard the most terrible example of someone saying one of my boundaries is my significant other is not going to dress in a certain way or is not going to speak in a certain way. And that is not a way that you can limit your significant other's behavior. You're not allowed to do that is not the same thing as if you do the thing, then my response is going to be because there's not judgment in
100%.
that. It's just cause and effect. And this is my,
Yeah. It goes back to behavioral theory, and
mhm,
conditioning and all of those things. So it goes back to that. We teach people how to treat us for
mhm,
100%.
right, right. Okay. So can you give us an example of what that's going to sound like in real life?
I knew you would ask that question, of course. So, yeah, so let me give you a couple of concrete examples because for me, if somebody doesn't give me the words to begin with, I can't come up with them myself.
Right. It's just theoretical until you really hear it.
For sure. So, something like if you raise your voice during our conversation, I'm going to step
Mm,
away and come back when things are calmer.
yeah. I love that one.
Absolutely.
Mhm,
If plans keep getting canceled last minute, I'm going to start making other arrangements rather than
mhm,
keeping my schedule open for you.
yeah.
Absolutely. Those really helps if you are keeping your tone calm and matter of fact. If we get
Mhm,
escalated or if we get emotional, sometimes the message can get lost in what we're saying. So, keeping your voice calm, speaking at a slower pace, that's going to help that person to know that you have control over your words now. And I'm likely
mhm,
going to have control over my behavior later. So, we aren't trying
mhm,
to control them at all. We are telling them, I'm going to do this if something happens.
mhm.
And then you've got to follow through with that as well. So that's really important is I don't set a boundary that I'm not willing to follow through with.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because again, it is your behavior, and
Mhm.
that's how you would follow through with the boundary. Like, what other follow through could there be?
Right.
That was fair and that could actually protect that guideline of what you need for yourself. And also, I really like those examples. The yelling one is a big one. I know that is a personal boundary for me,
Mhm.
and it also makes me think about how there's no standard for boundaries because for me, yelling is a boundary. And I know something that we've talked about in the past is that in your marriage, that's how you know that how else are you going to know that somebody's upset? So it's totally fine for y'all. It's not a boundary that needs to be set for y'all.
Right. Yeah. For my husband and I are passionate people, and so we will get, we'll get animated when it is we're having an agreement. Of course, we maintain respectful wording and things like that. But I think I absolutely, if we're communicating boundaries for ourselves, everybody does have different levels of comfort with different types of things. And so for you,
Mhm.
when you communicate that boundary to someone, that person knows I'm not going to be yelling at you, Azita, because I know
Mhm.
that that's not something that you're going to tolerate. You've told me that, and I've seen you follow
Right,
through on your boundaries before. So,
right.
100% boundaries are different
Mhm.
depending on who you are and your comfort level. You're right. They're
Yeah,
definitely not universal for everyone.
right. And the canceling plan things that
Mhm.
you hear on the opposite side, often hear a joke like, please cancel plans with me anytime. I would love to get that text like, oh, don't actually, we can't make it tonight. And then if I think that's another sign that if you're relieved that your plans fell through, that's when you could have set a boundary.
Yeah, 100%. Totally.
Okay. So then can you explain a little more about how that if then formula is different from just telling somebody to stop it.
Sure. Let's unpack that a little bit, right? So when you say stop doing X, so like for you, stop yelling at me, that puts all of the power and responsibility on the other person. You've just given your power to
Mm.
them. They get to choose
Mm.
whether they stop or not, and they simply might not comply. And then you're kind of stuck because you haven't said anything about what you're going to do. They've just bulldozed right over kind of a request you've made. And so they're not
Mhm.
really learning anything. And when you do that if then format, it keeps the power with you. So you're not waiting for them to change. You're deciding how you're going to respond. And
Right.
it also avoids blame language, which tends to get people defensive and they're less likely to hear you. So when
Mhm.
you're being calm, you're speaking slowly, you're not blaming them. We're trying to keep people out of fight and flight when we're in a
Mhm.
conflict or when we're setting a boundary. And that's going to help them be more receptive and not feel like you're judging them or you are scolding them. You're simply saying, hey, I'm going to do this. And that's a lot easier for
Mhm.
people to swallow, I think, when something that maybe they don't want to happen is about to happen, like you stepping out of the room because you don't want to be yelled at.
Right, right. If the goal is to continue this conversation and to communicate, then I need to hold that boundary so that I don't get that resentful feeling and not want to do that at all. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really
Hmm.
great example. It reminds me also of the I statement.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
feel X when you Y. I love that. I feel X when you Y. And if you I will Z. They
There.
really
Hey, something new. We're coming up with stuff every day, aren't we?
yeah, they go together.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. Adding another tool into that.
Yeah. Yeah, they kind of parallel each other in a way.
Hmm. Yeah.
So then are there other strategies that you might recommend?
Sure. We love tools in this podcast, right? We want our
We
viewers
love
to walk
tools.
away
Tools for
with
tough moments.
100%. We want our viewers or our listeners to walk away with, oh, like I want to try this out next. So I talked a little bit about this. Those like one of my tendencies is to say yes before I really think about it. So you
Mm,
can always do the pause and buy time move. What that's going to do is it's going to give you that power to tell yourself, I don't have to answer right now in this moment. So you could say something like, let me think about that and get back to you. That
mm,
is a
mhm.
complete valid response. It gives you space to check in with yourself. And then you can think about that. I feel X when you do Y. And because you did
Yeah,
Y, I'm going to do Z. It gives you a chance to think about your wording so that when you do
right.
communicate that boundary or you decline, you are doing so in the most respectful way that preserves that
Mhm.
relationship too.
Right, and you're not just reacting,
Yeah, for sure.
like choosing a response versus just reacting.
100%. Yeah. Um, I think we all have different values in our lives. And so knowing what your values are is really
Mm,
important. When it comes to me, I have a professional life that I really care about, but I also have a family. And so my values sometimes compete. I want to be a really great crisis professional, but I also want to be a really great wife and mother. And so when I'm making a decision, I have to say to myself, does saying yes to this align with how I want to show up in my life? And
mhm,
so it ensures that I'm showing up as a wife and as a mother and a community member just as much as I'm
mhm.
showing up as an employee or a boss for other people.
Yeah, it that makes me think back to that boundaries of the space where I can love myself and you at the same time and honoring who you want to be. And when you are acting outside your values, it feels like this is not who I want to be. And
Yeah.
I can really feel that as a source of resentment and discomfort and great place to set boundaries.
Yeah, for sure. But think about boundary setting like a muscle, like any skill. So you might want to start small if it's something that's really hard for you. Practice
Hmm.
those boundaries or saying no in those lower stakes situations. So
Like
like a
what? What would you
minor
say?
request. Like somebody might ask you if you want something simple. So for me, I go to a lot of places where like I will get a charge, I'll use my charge card and they'll say, "Hey, do you want your receipt?" Well, I'm going to get my receipt on my charge card on my statement. So that's a really simple one. No, I don't need a receipt. You could take the
No.
receipt, but no, I don't need it. What does it matter? That person's not going to get upset with you. But something simple
Hmm.
like that, where like, I just don't need that. Or do
Hmm.
you want a straw? No, I don't need a straw. Those are things that They seem like silly things to practice, but the more you
Yeah.
practice saying no, the better you're going to feel when it does come to something that's
Right.
like really important for you.
Right. Lower that bar. When can you practice saying no when there's no chance of an uncomfortable silence or defense or anything? Just no. No, thank
Yeah.
you. Let's practice saying
Mhm.
no. I love that.
And then the last tool I have today is probably my favorite. It comes from Jefferson Fisher. He will be, the link for his website will be in the description of this podcast in our resources. But he is great at giving very specific rules for how to communicate with people. And one of the things that he brought up in his book that I take forward with me is he said a lot of people, so Azita, if somebody invites you to dinner and you don't want to go, you might
Mm-hmm.
say, I'm sorry, but I can't make it. And so what we do is we will say, like, we'll apologize and say, but I can't make it. And then that person might follow up and say, well, why can't you come? We'd really like you to be there. So instead of that, think about say no and then express gratitude. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of thank you, but I can't make it, swap that and say, I can't make it, but thank you so much for thinking of me. So when we do the
Ah,
boundary and then the gratitude, it makes it a lot harder for that person to then ask, well, why can't you make it? What are you doing? Because you've ended with that gratitude. And if you want to level up your skills once you get used to, I can't make it, but thank you so much for thinking of me, you can add kindness. So decline, gratitude, kindness. And what that looks like is I can't make it, but thank you so much for thinking of me. I really hope you all have a wonderful time. It is very tough for people to then kind of pester you about why. And you
all
come across
right.
as really gracious and very close.
I love that. It's just swapping the order of that. Incredible. It's so subtle, but it sounds like it makes a huge difference. I can't wait to try. Okay. So then, last question for somebody watching who knows that they have a hard conversation coming up. They need to have this hard conversation. What are the most important things that you would like for them to remember?
Sure. When you are practicing your boundary setting and you are strengthening that muscle, you've got your decline then gratitude formula and your if you do X, I'll do Y. Just remember, you don't have to get it perfect right away. Even
Right.
if you say it messily, even if it's not perfect, communicate that boundary, say it with your whole chest. And even if it's not perfect, that's fine. It's better to communicate it in an imperfect way than not to communicate it at all. So it's not
Mhm.
a goal of I want to win the conversation or I need to say this perfectly or even that they're not going to have a reaction even if you do everything right, correct? It's to be honest about what you need. So that's really really
Mhm.
important to think about. It's fine to be nervous the first
Mm.
time that you do it, but the relief that you're going to feel afterward is usually worth it. And if the relationship can't survive you having a need and
Oh,
setting boundaries for yourself, that's really something to think about. That's important information for you to take stock of and really decide, is this the right situation? Is
mhm.
this the right relationship for me to be in if I don't have the right to express my needs too?
Wow. Incredible. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. It has been awesome talking about boundaries. I feel like I've learned so much, and I hope our listeners have too. Thank you for listening, all. And I hope you will check out some resources in the comments. And we'll see you next time.
And then